So over to Mark, who for this audience really needs no introduction. Mark has been programming Wednesday lectures for 30 odd years and has been contributing regular high quality lectures. Tonight he answered my request, could you do something about San Giovanni, because today is the Festa di San Giovanni, who St. John the Baptist, who is Florence's patron saint. Normally it's an occasion for pageantry and culture storico and fireworks. This year all of that's been somewhat muted. There was no fireworks, no culture storico, but there was a little bit of a parade from the football teams who then couldn't play. And tonight, after the sun goes down, there'll be illuminations around the city, which those of us who are here will be able to enjoy. Summer has arrived. It's now hot in Florence, so tonight will be a good night to have a little stroll, appropriately socially distanced, of course. So that's San Giovanni, and Mark is going to talk about the most interesting representation of San Giovanni's story in the art of Florence, which is the Parato di San Giovanni, a set of tapestries. So over to Mark.
Thank you, and thank you everybody for logging on. Now, the presiding genius over this talk of mine is Antonio Pollaiuolo, who is a painter. This is his wonderful picture of Hercules crushing the life out of Antaeus, lifting him up so that he is no longer in contact with his mother, Gaia, the earth, who is the source of all his strength. I will remind you a little about Antonio's career, because I shall not afterwards refer to it. He was born in Florence around 1431 and died in Rome in 1498. He had a younger brother called Piero, from whose works his own are not easily distinguished. Antonio was a pupil of Domenico Veneziano and was much influenced both by Donatello and by Andrea del Castagno. His workshop in Florence was extremely successful, producing bronzes and goldsmiths' work, as well as paintings, in rivalry with the workshop of Verrocchio. In the 1480s, Antonio left Florence for Rome, where he made beautiful bronze funerary monuments for two popes, Sixtus IV and Innocent VIII. In his life, Antonio Pollaiuolo, Giorgio Vasari informs us that from the design of this artist, there was made for San Giovanni in Florence 2 tunicles and a chasuble and a cope of double brocade, woven all in one seamless piece, and for the borders and ornamentation were embroidered scenes from the life of St. John with exquisite workmanship and skill, con sottilissimo magistero ed arte, by Paolo da Verona, divinely inspired in that profession and most rare and ingenious above all others. And by him the figures were executed with the needle, as well as if they'd been painted by Antonio's brush. It is a remarkable fact that this set of liturgical embroideries has survived and is now on display in the Opera del Duomo Museum here in Florence. Known as the Parato di San Giovanni, the set is certain to have been among the various objects, including all the celebrated Florentine reliquaries, that were displayed on top of this movable silver altar, set up inside the baptistry on the feast days of St. John the Baptist. His nativity on Midsummer Day, 24th of June, today, his decollation or beheading on the 29th of August, his conception on 24th of September. A document of 1425 informs us that the silver altar was kept in a special cupboard in the house of the Operai and was installed in the baptistry on the eve of the Nativity of St. John. The silver altar was apparently not used for celebrating Mass, but it did have a powerful symbolic significance in Florence as the focus of the city's civic and religious aspiration. the umbilicus orbis, or tummy button of the city, especially when it was erected over the font on Midsummer Day and loaded with treasures, as described in a letter of 1475 from Piero Bernardo Cennini to Pirino Amarino. Apart from the famous silver crucifix by Pollaiuolo, which you can see in this old Alinari photograph and still stands today on the silver altar inside the museum, Cennini mentions thuribles, incense holders, chalices, cruets, and candlesticks, all of silver or gold. The heaping of gifts on altars is specifically mentioned in the liturgy for 24th of June, for the secreta of the Mass begins, Tua Domine munelibus altaria cumulamus, we heap up gifts upon thine altars, O Lord. There would have been relics, such as the celebrated relic of the finger bone of St. John the Baptist, that was donated to the city of Florence in 1421 by Baldassare Cossa, the quondam Papa, or former Pope, in exchange for the very unusual privilege of being buried inside the baptistry. The first batch of St. John's relics, including his jaw and some vertebrae, had been bought by the city of Florence from a Venetian widow in the late 14th century. The Parato di San Giovanni, as we now have it, consists of 27 rectangles, ranging in size from 51 by 30 centimeters to 30 by 22 centimeters, which were originally sewn onto a cope, a chasuble, a dalmatic, and a tunicle. Repeated liturgical use of these vestments over some 250 years meant that they were very worn out by about 1730, when they stopped being used. Antonio Francesco Gori, the antiquary, who was provost of the baptistry, informs us in his Testaurus Veterum Depictorum of 1756 that 26 years previously, he personally cut the embroideries from the vestments and mounted them behind glass on wooden panels so that they could be displayed behind the high altar, presumably in the baptistry. Unfortunately, he made no record of their original order, so we have no idea which rectangle went on which vestment. We do, however, know that the principal scene, the baptism of Christ, which would probably have been on the hood of the coat or possibly in the center of the chasuble, is missing. Antonio Gori describes the vestments as being very voluminous, so that they almost swept the ground as they were used in liturgical ceremonies. And in this case, they would have appeared extremely old-fashioned by Gori's time, even if they were not worn out by 250 years in use in processions, etc. The resected embroidered panels are recorded as being part of the Opera del Duomo Museum in 1887. They were restored in the 1980s and again in 2015. The technique used for these embroideries is what Vasari calls appunto serrato, generally known as or nue. This involved extremely fine stitching so that the work surface or woof of the embroidery is almost invisible, point nue or punto velato, and was capable of reproducing the subtlest gradations of shading, flesh tones and folds of drapery in a way that brought the art of embroidery as close as possible to the art of painting. This is the point of Vasari's remark about the embroiderer Paolo da Verona, dal quale non furono condotte manco bene le figure con l'ago che se le avesse dipinto Antonio col pennello. The figures are done as well with the needle as though they had been painted by Antonio's brush. Work of this kind evidently required the constant presence of the painter-designer, whose expressive needs it sought to meet. They are stitched in silks of bright colors upon finely woven canvas, with gold threads worked in horizontally in such quantity that in certain lights the embroideries gleam like plates of gold, wrote Maud Crutwell in 1906. Vasari seems to have thought that there was only one embroiderer, Paolo da Verona, but we know from the documents that Paolo was one among many. No fewer than 11 workers from different countries worked on these embroideries for 14 years. The documents mention Coppino di Giovanni di Melina from Flanders, Piero di Piero from Venice, Paolo from Antwerp, Gianni Scura from Navarre, Antonio di Giovanni from Florence, Gianpaolo from Perpignan, etc. The Parato di San Giovanni was commissioned by the Guild of the Calimala, or Arte della Mercantanzia, whose coat of arms, an eagle perched on a wool sack, occurs repeatedly in the designs. This was a very prestigious project, reflecting honor not only on the Church of Florence's patron saint, but on the powerful Calimala itself. The total expense to the Calimala was between 3,000 and 4,000 golden florins, an enormous sum of money. We can only be amazed at the Guild's persistence and tenacity in carrying out this immense and expensive project. Work started in 1466 during the pontificate of Pope Paul II Barbo, when Giovanni di Diotisalvi was archbishop and the gout-ridden Piero di Cosimo de' Medici was de facto ruler of Florence. The first mention in the documents of Antonio del Pollaiuolo is in 1469, when he was paid 90 florins for his designs. In 1480, he received another 90. And by July that year, the embroideries must have been finished, for the vestments they were to adorn were ordered. These vestments, the cope and chasuble for the celebrant, a dalmatic for the deacon, and a tunicle for the subdeacon, were of pure white linen, pure white brocade, of such fine workmanship that it cost 20 florins the braccia. By this time, the Pope was Sixtus IV, and the Archbishop was Rinaldo Orsini, who had been brought to Florence at the request of the Medici because he was related to Clarice, the Roman wife of Lorenzo il Magnifico. We may suppose that when they were finally ready, the vestments were worn by Archbishop Orsini at solemn high mass on the Feast of the Baptist, principally on the 24th of June, but also on the 29th of August, the beheading. And in the 15th century, there was a third feast in late September commemorating the conception of the precursor. We even hear of a fourth one on the octave of the Epiphany, intended to commemorate St. John's baptism of Christ in the River Jordan. We may suppose that the vestments were also worn in the following century by the Archbishops Giuliano and Alessandro de' Medici, both of whom ascended the papal throne as Clement VII and Leo XI, respectively. Antonio del Pollaiuolo's designs for the Parato di San Giovanni, for which, as we have seen, he was paid in 2 installments, 11 years apart, are of the greatest iconographical, historical, and religious interest. They form the fullest and most articulated treatment of the life of the precursor in Florentine art. As inspiration, Antonio and his advisors had 3 examples of the Vita Johannis close at hand: the mosaics in the baptistry, the bronze doors by Andrea Pisano, and the movable silver altar. The mosaics, dating roughly from 1280 to 1305, show 15 scenes from the life of the Baptist, beginning with the Annunciation of the angel Gabriel to Zacharias and ending with the burial of St. John. The third mosaic, at the top right in this photograph, shows the child St. John setting out into the wilderness, a subject that became very popular in later Florentine art, though it does not appear among the surviving embroideries. Andrea's bronze doors are signed and dated 1330 and were installed on the south side of the Florentine baptistry in 1336. They show 20 episodes from the life of the Baptist, beginning and ending with the same ones as the mosaics. The lower 8 quatrefoils are taken up with the 3 theological virtues plus humility and the 4 cardinal virtues. The silver altar, which had not been finished when Antonio made the designs for the embroideries, had 12 scenes when completed, 8 on the front and 2 at each end. In this photograph, the 2 ends have been turned outwards so that they are parallel with the front. Begun in 1366, the silver altar was originally intended as a frontal, antependium or dorsal, for the stone altar which still stands in the scarsella of the baptistry. It took well over 100 years to make. To illustrate the range and variety and completeness of Antonio's scheme for the embroideries, to which he devoted as much care and attention as though he were planning a major cycle of frescoes, I will run quickly through the episodes in their narrative order, which is neither the order they were made, nor that in which they were arranged on the vestments. I will then return to consider the earlier scenes in more detail, since I feel I ought to be concentrating on the nativity of the Baptist rather than on his later career. The sources for Antonio's Vita Ioannis are the 4 Gospels, quite simply. Although attempts have been made to establish the influence of other texts, such as an anonymous life of the Baptist, often added to Domenico Cavalca's Vitae dei Santi Padri, they are not at all persuasive. The iconographic scheme of the embroideries is the fruit of a meditation on the life of the Baptist from his birth to his death, as set out in the Gospel of St. Luke, chapters 1, 3, and 7, supplemented by Matthew, chapters 3 and 14, and by Mark, chapter 6, and by the 1st chapter of John. Antonio's theological advisors would no doubt have been familiar with the elegant Latin hexameters of St. Paulinus of Nola, writing early in the 5th century, whose 6th Carmen is entitled De Sancta Ioanni Baptista. This poem might have helped them break down the narrative into salient episodes, but they could probably have done just as well without it. So we start with the Annunciation to Zachary in the temple, when the angel Gabriel appears to the priest Zachary at the hour of incense. While the multitude of the people are praying outside, Gabriel informs Zachary that his elderly wife Elizabeth, presumed to be barren, will shortly bear him a son who will be called John. Next, a hatless Zachary leaves the temple, having been struck dumb as a punishment for his incredulity. And when he came out, he could not speak to them, and they understood that he had seen a vision in the temple, and he made signs to them and remained dumb. On the right, the visitation, when the Virgin Mary meets her cousin Elizabeth in the hill country of Judea. The birth of the Baptist, with St. Elizabeth lying in bed and handmaids attending to the baby, and on the right, the circumcision of St. John. Above, 2 winged putti support the stemma of the Kalimala. Zachary writes the name of his son, and St. John preaches to the multitude. Here we see St. John's audience divided by gender, just as in a 15th century sermon. I'm thinking, for example, of the picture in the Opera del Duomo Museum in Siena by Sano di Pietro, showing St. Bernardino preaching with a cloth fence separating the men from the women. The imaginative achievement of Antonio del Pollaiuolo and his theological advisors is to have reinterpreted the salient episodes of the Baptist life into contemporary Florentine terms. To use a linguistic metaphor, the Latin of the Gospels has been fluently and expertly translated into a vernacular Florentine idiom. In these embroideries, the disciples and other sacred personages wear ancient-style robes, whereas members of the crowd wear plausible 15th century costumes. Here's St. John preaching before Herod and Herodias. The Tetrarch Herod Antipas and his wife Herodias are seated to the left. At the far left, the Tetrarch's stepdaughter Salome, St. John's nemesis, turns towards us and points to the Baptist with her right hand. Salome is not named in the Gospels. It is Flavius Josephus who tells us what Herodias' daughter was called. Here the setting is a splendid Renaissance interior. There is great variety in the animated poses of the Baptist audience. This is the Varietas that was commended to artists by Leon Battista Alberti. Sprightly youths are juxtaposed with bearded ancients and modest damsels with more matronly types. Especially remarkable is the variety of their hats. This was a particularly Florentine phenomenon, noticed by contemporaries. A letter of 1460 by Zaccaria da Pisa says, "Poi le mi parerono di ogni nazione e tanta varietà di acconciature di testa." They seemed to be of every nation, and there was so much variety in their headgear. St. John preaching about baptism. St. Luke's Gospel tells us, "And he came into all the country about the Jordan, preaching the baptism of penitence for the remission of sins." There is delightful vaulting, beautifully drawn in perspective. Here's the baptism of the Neophytes. The horizontal format leaves room for a still life of discarded clothing, as well as for the active figures undressing or being undressed on the left. The three anatomically convinced kneeling neophytes. I think Antonio probably borrowed these three kneeling nudes from the ones in this scene on the marble font, made around 1370 by Tuscan masters in the Circle of Orcagna, that was substituted for the large central font familiar to Dante. This one is still in use, and 3 of my children were christened in it. Christ baptizes St. John. This somewhat rare episode has no direct scriptural basis. Rather, it is an extrapolation from the Baptist's remark, "Ego a te debeo baptizzare et tu venis ad me." I ought to be baptized by thee, and comest thou to me. St. John meets the high priest. There are 5 horsemen in the background and a 6th horse held by the bridle. A small deer crouching beside the fountain on the right is, I think, intended to evoke Psalm 41, "Quemabodum desiderat cervus ad fontes aquarum," as the stag panteth after the fountains of water, which is sung during the Easter baptisms. On the right, St. John preaching to the priests and Levites. Unfortunately, it's impossible to read the words on the dialogue scroll. Ecce agnus Dei, behold the Lamb of God. In his designs, Antonio makes sparing use of dialogue scrolls, preferring to entrust the suggestion of speech to gesture and posture. But here is a legible scroll in the scene where St. John indicates Jesus as the Lamb of God, bearing the very well-known words that are spoken at every Mass when the priest turns towards the people holding the Sanctissimum in his hand. The whole point about the relic of the finger bone that Baldassare Cossa presented to Florence was that it was thought to be the very finger that had pointed to Christ, the Redeemer and Savior, indicating him as the long-awaited Messiah. On the left, Herodias accuses the Baptist before Herod Antipas. Again, there is a magnificent Renaissance architectural interior with Corinthian columns and pilasters and the stemma of the Kalimala inside a roundel. All three right hands are raised, all three left hands are lowered. On the right, St. John is arrested. This was evidently at the instigation of Herodias, who was irritated with him for saying that Herod ought not to have married her, as she was already married to his brother. On the left, St. John is led to prison. Beneath a rocky landscape, the Baptist is propelled along the road to martyrdom by heavily armed men, his arms pinioned behind his back, his bare legs contrasting markedly with the metal-clad lower limbs of his captors. The scimitar raised up behind him will reappear in a later scene. On the right, the disciples visit the Baptist in prison. The heavily matriculated battle in the prison is somewhat evocative of the Palazzo Signoria, I feel. What it is intended to represent is the formidable fortress of Machaeros on the eastern side of the Dead Sea, which had been built by the father of Herod Antipas, Herod the Great, in what is now Jordan. According to Flavius Josephus, it was the site of the Baptist's execution. The dance of Salome. Salome has her hands on her hips and sways enticingly, her long slashed sleeves forming volutes below her elbows. The two rather stolid musicians on the right seem more suited to accompany one of those acrobatic medieval Salomes, more tumbler than dancer, such as we find on Romanesque capitals. It has always been assumed that there was an erotic element to Salome's dance. Herodias remains impassive, while Herod leans forward appreciatively. He's about to make his rash promise to the dancing girl of anything she wants, anything at all, up to the value of half his kingdom. At the instigation of her mother, she will request that the head of John the Baptist be brought to her in a dish. The beheading of St. John. The architectural setting vaguely evokes Piazza della Signoria, where real executions took place. This is a very powerful scene of martyrdom, with the demoniac-looking executioner brandishing his scimitar, a pose that cannot fail to recall Pollaiuolo's famous engraving, The Battle of the Nudes, and a kneeling St. John, whose attitude embodies the spirit of Christian resignation. This is Pollaiuolo's celebrated engraving, which was highly praised by Vasari and in more recent times by Bernard Berenson. However, Leonardo da Vinci may have had it in mind when he wrote that artists should not make their nudes wooden and without grace, so that they seem to look like a sack of walnuts rather than the surface of a human body, or indeed a bundle of radishes rather than muscular nudes. Even Berenson, who so admired this engraving, speaks of the hideous faces of most of the figures and their scarcely less hideous bodies. The Feast of Herod. Here the severed head in the dish appears twice, once on the left being shown to Salome by a page, and once on the right being handed to Herodias. Salome presents St. John's head to her mother. The enthroned Herodias stoops forward eagerly, making a clawing gesture with both hands. Salome runs nimbly towards her mother, holding out the dish with its horrid contents. Peculiarly enough, Herodias seems to be wearing Herod's crown, and it is perhaps slightly odd that neither mother nor daughter ever wear quite the same clothes from one scene to the next. I think the reason that Antonio devoted a separate scene to this somewhat superfluous episode is that he was inspired by the marvelously graceful panel on Andrea Pisano's door. On the left, St. John is carried to the tomb. St. Matthew says, and his disciples came and took the body and buried it. On the right, St. John is buried. Here, as in Andrea Pisano's bronze doors, the Baptist's burial is a separate scene from the carrying of his headless body to the tomb. It was thought traditionally that the Baptist was buried in Sebaste in Samaria, now in the West Bank. It was there that his bones were dug up and burned by the pagan emperor Julian in the 4th century. Christ on in limbo. This is a wonderful end to the sequence, a scene that has no precedent in the earlier Baptist cycles. The subject is not literally eschatological, but inasmuch as the scene takes place post-mortem, it points to the last things. Modern commentators have made much of the non-scriptural character of this encounter between Christ and the Baptist in limbo, adducing apocryphal sources such as the so-called Gospel of Nicodemus. But in fact, we need look no further than a clause in the Apostles' Creed, Descendit ad inferos, for the very well-known episode of Christ's descent into the abode of the dead, a subject known in medieval England as the harrowing of hell. Christ, not yet resurrected in his body, is surrounded by various patriarchs. We recognize Adam and Eve in the foreground, dressed in animal skins, Adam's foot resting on the blade of his mattock. The Baptist emerges eagerly from the doorway to greet his cousin, planting his foot firmly on the broken down door, beneath which grovels a defeated demon. Now I want to go back to the early scenes, the ones that illustrate a passage in the 1st chapter of St. Luke's Gospel, the narrative of the Baptist's birth. Here is the priest Zachary, shown inside the temple, standing to the right of the altar of incense and swinging a thurible, the design of which is very similar to one drawn by Antonio. An angel is shown swooping down from the upper left. He is about to tell Zachary that his prayer has been heard and that his elderly wife Elizabeth will bear a son who is to be called John. And thou shalt have joy and gladness, and many shall rejoice in his nativity. Zachary evinces mild skepticism, remarking that he is an old man and that his wife is advanced in her day. Whereupon the angel indignantly announces himself as Gabriel, who stands before God. And behold, thou shalt be dumb, and shalt not be able to speak until the day wherein these things shall come to pass, because thou hast not believed my words, which shall be fulfilled in their time. Medieval preachers listed as the first of the Baptist special privileges the fact that the same angel, Gabriel, announced both his birth and the birth of Christ. They also speculated on the reasons for Zachary's punishment, which on the face of it seemed unfair, since several other biblical characters expressed doubts at the messages of angels, but are not punished. The consensus seems to have been that the various circumstances combined to make Zachary's incredulity culpable. The people waiting outside, wondering that he tarried so long inside the temple, are represented by 4 figures standing beneath the arches, 2 on each side. The composition may have been suggested to Antonio by the Roman sarcophagus that formerly stood outside the south door of the baptistry. It may be a false memory, but I rather think that the first time I came to Florence in the early 1970s, the sarcophagus was still in place. It is now in the museum. Another source is, of course, the beautiful quatrefoil on Andrea Pisano's doors. The thurible is swinging, attached to an invisible chain. The architectural setting is deeply satisfying. The stemma of the Kalimala appears inside a roundel on the side of the altar of incense. As for the name Zachary, it is the English form of the Latin Zacharias. Apart from the many popes called John, named either after the Baptist or the Evangelist, the only pope with a Jewish name is Pope Zachary in the 8th century, named after the Baptist's father. Zachary's confusion as he rapidly exits from the temple is suggested by the loss of his hat and by his plunging diagonal movement. He's apparently been deaf as well as dumb. His family has to communicate with him by sign language. Here, the bystander's surprise is eloquently conveyed by hand gestures. The second figure on from the right, with his back to us, in a swaggering pose, with his feet wide apart, was almost certainly borrowed by Domenico Ghirlandaio for his fresco in the Tornabuoni Chapel, showing the expulsion of Joachim from the temple. Although the embroideries were very seldom on view, the solemn circumstances of their ostentatio, or public display, must have helped to impress Antonio's brilliant designs vividly in the imaginations of his younger contemporaries. The scene of the visitation shows the Virgin Mary, accompanied rather unusually by St. Joseph, greeting her pregnant cousin Elizabeth, who is attended by a handmaid. Some medieval commentators thought that St. Joseph must have gone with his betrothed on her journey, as it would not have been seemly to allow her to travel alone. But the consensus was that he did not do so, since otherwise he would have heard Elizabeth's greeting to Mary, and therefore would not have been surprised when the signs of pregnancy appeared, and would not have decided to dismiss her secretly. Above these four figures is the dove of the Holy Spirit inside a sunburst, flanked by two adoring angels and surrounded by more schematic representations of seraphim and cherubim. Now, the religious significance of the visitation as regards St. John is that it marks his sanctification inside the womb. For medieval preachers, the second of the Baptist's special privileges was that he leapt within his mother's belly at the approach of his unborn cousin Jesus. As Elizabeth explained to her cousin Mary, "For behold, as soon as the voice of thy salutation sounded in my ears, the infant in my womb leapt for joy." In the Middle Ages, it became the common theological opinion that the effects of original sin were removed from St. John's soul at this moment. More ingenuously, some commentators interpreted the leaping as the unborn baby's attempt to stand up in the presence of Jesus. Rather more imaginatively, St. Jerome supposed that the fetus was trying to burst out of the womb. In his 107th letter to Laeta on the education of her daughter Paula, I found this passage. "So it was that the prophet John leapt and rejoiced at the arrival of Mary, for he heard the thunder of the Lord's voice on the Virgin's lips and was eager to break out from his mother's womb to greet him." The introit for today's feast reads, "When I was still lying in my mother's womb, the Lord sent his summons to me by name. My utterance is a sword he has been keeping ready sharpened under cover of his hand. Here is an arrow he has chosen out carefully." The Nativity of the Baptist is shown as taking place in a magnificently designed interior. Antonio may have been influenced by Filippo Lippi's frescoes of the life of the Baptist in Prato Cathedral. He seems to have been impressed by the dramatic effect of Filippo's deep and sometimes eccentrically plunging perspectival settings. Another influence might be the architecture of the Cardinal of Portugal's chapel at San Miniato al Monte. The general arrangement, with St. Elizabeth being offered refreshment as she lies in bed and various women attending to the baby, was no doubt suggested by Andrea Pisano's elegant quatrefoil of the same subject. When Antonio came to design this episode for the silver altar a few years later, he added some extra figures, but strangely enough, he eliminated the delightful figure of the sleeping woman at the foot of the bed. The happiness of this scene is a reflection of the angel's words, "Et multi in nativitate eos gaudebun," and many rejoiced in his nativity. All these attendant women are required by the text. The evangelist St. Luke specifically tells us, "And her neighbors and kinsfolks heard that the Lord had showed his great mercy towards her, and they congratulated with her." None of the women, apart from St. Elizabeth herself, has a halo. So we may conclude that Antonio and his advisors did not receive the tradition that the Virgin Mary was present at this birth. For our purposes, this is the central scene of the Parato, and it would be as well to say something about today's feast, which will be celebrated this evening with illuminations. The earliest recorded feast of the Baptist is indeed that of his nativity on the 24th of June. Christmas, the celebration of the birth of Christ, had been fixed on 25th December. It was known that St. John was born 6 months before Jesus because of the words of the angel Gabriel recorded by St. Luke. This is the 6th month with her that was called barren. So the birthday of the Baptist was fixed as a sort of summer Christmas on Midsummer Day. There are many strands to the symbolism of the two birthdays, one at the winter and one at the summer solstice. And one of these strands is as follows. The birth of Christ is celebrated on the pagan feast of the Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, after which date the sun increases, whereas St. John is associated with Midsummer Day, after which the sun declines. This is in accordance with the Baptist's remark, Illum pulset crescere me autem minui. He must increase, but I must decrease. As a matter of fact, the date of the Baptist's birthday can be established independently of this symbolism. St. Augustine remarks in Sermon 290 that the Church generally celebrates the festivals of saints on the day of their death, which is their great birthday, their birthday to eternal life. He adds that the nativity of St. John the Baptist is excepted from this general rule. The reason for this distinction is because the saint was sanctified in his mother's womb, so that he was brought forth holy into the world. A deeper reason is that St. John's birth has an immediate relation to Christ, whereas his death relates to himself alone. There's another extremely elaborate architectural setting for the scene of the child's circumcision. At the top, on either side of the putti supporting the stemma of the Kalimala, there are windows very like the ones on the baptistry. Lower down, there's a splendid vaulted loggia with scalloped lunettes in the background. This is not supposed to be the temple, but the family house, as is clear from St. Luke's Gospel. And it came to pass that on the 8th day they came to circumcise the child, and they called him by his father's name Zachary. And his mother answering said, "Not so, but he shall be called John." And they said to her, "There is none of thy kindred that is called by that name." In the case of the Baptist, the significance of the circumcision, or brit, which was not very often illustrated, is that it was the moment of the imposition of the child's name, a matter that gave rise to discussion. And there is something else to be noted here. Circumcision under the old dispensation was regarded by medieval Christian theologians as having a quasi-sacramental force, and thus of prefiguring baptism. So this is one of many examples of the Baptist acting as a linchpin between the Old Testament and the New. He is the last of the prophets, the first of the disciples. And here we see Zachary sitting on an elaborate chair, writing down the correct name of his son. And demanding a writing tablet, he wrote saying, "John is his name." And they all wondered. Rather than a writing tablet, Zachary has a large scroll on his knee. He is clutching an inkhorn in his left hand while he writes with his right. It was Zachary's wife, Elizabeth, who had earlier insisted that the child be called John on the occasion of his circumcision. The suggestion had caused general amazement because nobody else in the family had that name. Her husband, however, backed her up. In doing so, he regained his voice. So that brings us to the end of this set of 27 embroideries made to illustrate in considerable detail the life of St. John the Baptist, the precursor, the patron of the city of Florence. I hope you have enjoyed listening about them. And if you have not already done so, I hope that you will want to go and see them in the Opera del Duomo Museum when you have an opportunity to do so.
Thank you very much indeed, Mark. That was fascinating. Maybe you can, there you go, let the people in.
Yeah.
Hello, everybody. And as is our custom, if you want to make a point or ask a question, feel free to unmute yourself. The floor is yours.
Simon and Mark, this is Chris and Alice. Hi.
Hi, Chris.
Hey, great to hear you and see you. Just was wondering about the color of the tapestries. Do you think that has it faded tremendously, or do you think?
Yeah, it's faded a lot. I think the silks have faded, but the gold doesn't seem to have faded. Some of them are in better condition than others, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
Has anyone ever tried to do a kind of factually based recreation of what those colors were like?
That I don't know. I must say I'm not an expert on embroidery, on the techniques.
But they're so spectacular. I mean, I'm imagining them also in their original colors. Is quite.
Yes.
Yeah.
But what amazes me is the care that went into planning them. When one imagines that when they were sewed on the vestments, they weren't particularly easy to see, and people would have been moving around.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Also, they're quite small, actually. I'd kind of lost track of that in those big images.
Yeah.
The original, right, they're on the vestments.
They're fairly small. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Could I
Julia.
make a comment?
Sure, Julia.
Yes, Sister Julia.
Anne Barbetti was writing on this for her degree at the University of Florence.
Oh, yeah.
And we've been working on her book. It's a wonderful book where she's describing, she's an expert in textiles and embroidery, and she's here in Florence. And she was working on this with Professor Dora Lisci. And also, one of the things I love about this story is Elizabeth also has to be literate in order to know from Zachariah, who is now sordo-muto, what the name of the baby is.
Yes,
How
she could
else-
evidently read.
Yes. How else could she have been told by Zachariah the name
Exactly.
of the baby? Unless he had written it also for her and she had been able to read it.
Indeed.
I've lost.
So,
Yeah.
other,
May I say something?
sure.
I'm
Anne.
Anne Barbetti. I think this speech by Mark was very interesting, and he had very good sources for getting documents and things. But I wanted to mention that the family of John the Baptist had many. It was a very important family. Both they were rather, let's say, high in the society, let's say, in contrasting to the life of Mary, who was, Mary and Joseph lived in, they were more poor. And also there's a contrast between the life of John when he's with his family, and then later when he's in the woods and then doing his mission. But his family was very erudite. It comes out in many of the sources.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Good to have you aboard, Anne. Thanks for joining.
Well, it was my pleasure.
Yeah. In the chat, Christina's asked, is there any reason why the embroiderers were men? Did women not do embroidery? Good question. Do Mark or Anne have a view on
Well,
that?
I mean, obviously they did do embroidery. The so-called Bayer tapestry, which is not a tapestry at all, was certainly embroidered by women.
By women, yes.
It happens that these 11 needleworkers were all men. It is remarkable. I don't know why.
Well, maybe because they were some of them were imported, had lived in Florence, and they were from Flanders. And this method of ornoué is a technique. It's not one stitch, it's a series of stitches. And it was a technique that was brought in from Flanders.
Right.
And so it was, these men knew how to do it. And this panel, these embroiders are the first of Florence in this method. And then many other artists like Botticelli used this method as well.
Right.
Interesting.
Well, at least one of them is identified as being from Flanders.
Yes. Yes.
So, other thoughts or questions from anybody?
Yeah.
Okay, Christine's put another one up on the chat, which is, even in the embroidery, Mary's robe is blue. When did that idea that Mary should be depicted in blue start? The origins
She's
of Mary?
always in blue and red.
Yeah.
Yes.
Do you know the origins of that, Anne?
Pardon?
Do you know the origins of the tradition that Mary should be in blue as
No,
opposed
I probably have come across it, but I don't remember. But she's always in blue and red.
Yeah, that's true.
Yes, I don't know when it started. I should think it goes back quite a long way.
Well, maybe because of the symbols of the colors, maybe.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what the protocol is for asking questions.
Please.
Yep, please.
Yeah.
And I don't know if this was asked earlier. I'm sort of a word person, and I don't know, in this context, what does the word parato mean?
Well, it's a good question. I think it means, in this case, it means set. It means a set of vestments.
Set.
Yes.
A set of vestments. Okay, thank you very much.
At least that's my understanding. If somebody may contradict me, I don't.
No, that's fine.
Thank you. Very interesting talk.
Thank you.
Okay, any more for any more? We're just coming up to the top of the hour. We can always go on if people want to, but if we're got out all the questions and points people wish to make.
Simon, could I ask one more question?
Sure.
Mark, are there any existing drawings for those? You might have mentioned that in the beginning. I missed the beginning.
No, Chris, there aren't any drawings. I imagine they were consumed by the embroiderers. You know, unfortunately, none of the drawings survived. He, of course, Antonio was paid quite a considerable amount of money for the drawings, 180 florins altogether. We do have a few drawings by Antonio and by his brother Piero. But unfortunately, none of the ones for the embroideries. It would be very interesting to compare them.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Alrighty, any more for any more? Lots of nice comments in the comments. People have enjoyed the talk. Some are heading out to enjoy the evening or lunchtime if that's where you are. So once again, thanks everyone for tuning in. See you all next week for our new panel on Firenze Now, which is fulfilling the mission of these talks to look at the contemporary scene as well as the historic one. And
the fireworks.
And there aren't any fireworks tonight because of lockdown to stop the, well, not lockdown, the riapertura, where we're still trying to keep social distancing, but there's going to be special illuminations. So
excellent.
So that's all good. All right, folks, we'll see you all next week. And if you have a moment and a dollar, please don't forget to donate. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.